At this point, I'd like to recognize Commissioner Jenkins is here. Commissioner. So move on to presentations. We have the Hobe Sound Land Development Regulations update.
Any intro? Okay. No.
Dana Little from the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council is here to give us the lowdown on it.
Well, thank you for having me. Should I use a microphone, or can you hear me in the back? You can hear me, or thumbs up to a microphone? Okay. Thank you for having me. My name is Dana Little. I'm the Urban Design Director for Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. For those of you that don't know, quickly, we're a public agency. We've been in Martin County since 1972, I think. We work with local governments exclusively throughout our four-county region, which is Palm Beach, Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River counties. We've worked for many, many years, decades actually, with Martin County CRA, City of Stewart, and in fact, we were part of the large team that helped the visioning process 20 years ago, 18 years ago, 20 years ago now, for the different CRAs when they were established back in 2000. Actually, most of our work was in Rio, but we've been working with the CRA in Martin County for that long. Last year, we were asked by Martin County CRA, the Martin County Growth Management Department, and Commissioner Jenkins and the Commission to enter into an agreement to update the land development regulations, basically the codes, the rules that apply to the 6 different CRAs. There used to be 7, but when Indiantown incorporated, it dropped to 6. And just a brief history. The rules were established initially back in 2000, as I said, and they were developed by different hands at different times and sometimes with different intentions. And for any of you that might be in the planning business, you know sometimes the rules, the codes, can reflect political desires or political dislikes, or they can reflect all sorts of things. So over time, what's happened is that the CRA codes, while well-intended, have become, in some cases, convoluted, confusing, in conflict with one another, and we've tried with Martin County periodically over the years to clean them up, but finally it was like, let's just start over. I'm going to go through a little bit of that this evening. Tonight's presentation is just to sort of introduce some of you for the first time what it is we're up to, the scope of it. We're not making any recommendations tonight. We're going to come back to you as an NAC, we'll see the date in a moment, with some actual recommendations. But tonight, sort of to tee up the effort with all of you. As I said, we started back in August. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but this is all of our public meetings to date. When we start, the way it was scheduled is that there are 6 CRAs. We started in Jensen Beach. We were to start a new CRA or another CRA every 3 months. It's actually a very aggressive schedule, and I remember when we were before the Board of County Commissioners to get our agreement executed, we're like, well, we think this is going to take 24 months. And Commissioner Jenkins is like, that's too long. He didn't actually do that, but this is a very, very involved process. And Commissioner Jenkins has been very much supportive and helpful throughout this whole effort. When we started this effort, one thing that we realized was that if we tinker, for those of you that don't know, there are 2 primary planning documents, if you will, that tell you what you can and cannot do with your land. There's the Martin County Comprehensive Plan, which I think most people have heard of and are familiar with. That establishes some rules at a higher level, let's say 30,000 feet. And then you have your LDRs, or your code or zoning code. Those are the rules on the ground. That tells you how many parking spaces you need. That tells you precisely what use can go where. Tells you what your setbacks are, that kind of stuff. They are to be in concert with one another. They are to communicate and be consistent and work with each other. This higher level document, which by the way, is partially regulated at the state level. I'm telling you this little story because when we started, our scope was just to look at the lower level stuff, the codes. Very important, but don't tinker with the comp plan. We realized very early on, if we don't address some of the issues as they relate to the CRAs that are in the comprehensive plan, then what we do with the code is going to be a waste of time. And then we're back to where we started. And at that point, I kind of hope to get off the project because I don't want to touch the comprehensive plan of Martin County. But working very closely with Nikki Van Bono, Irene Settlemeyer, Susan Corres, her staff, the legal department of Martin County, which is very, very important, the engineering department, we decided to, and you'll see this in a moment, create a new chapter for the comprehensive plan dedicated to the CRAs. And we created a new chapter in the codes dedicated to the CRAs. Because the CRAs are unique. As you know, the CRAs are your historic areas. They're areas of smaller lots of infill. They have historic structures, historic prominence, and their location is key. They are different. I'm not saying necessarily better, but they are different than, say, Martin Downs, where the codes were really perfected and then lifted and brought back over here, and there's a lot of conflict there. So this is our schedule. We're about more than halfway through this effort now. We need to wrap it up by the end of summer. I know you can't read any of that, either can I, but this is just to show you that, believe it or not, we're actually still on track. Even though we took a lot longer in the beginning to sort out, we had to deconstruct the rules and deconstruct the comp plan to figure out what exactly it was we were going to do. This is where we are today, January 15th. We will be back here March 11th in this room to provide you some specific recommendations, and you'll have access to those recommendations as well. To boil it down, there's really a few key items that we're talking about here. Number one, as I mentioned, the comprehensive plan. When the CRAs were created, the goal back then was, well, you know, these historic areas had mixed use, they had smaller setbacks. Dixie High was a perfect example, and Bridge Road, perfect example of that. The quaint areas that are historic to the CRAs at the time were actually prohibited to build. You know, they just kind of lingered on through history, and our rules had changed such that you couldn't do more of that. So the thought back then was, well, if we want to allow for, say, mixed use, or things that you see in Stewart or Jensen or Rio, we need to provide for that. Rather, though, than rezoning all the properties and everything, the county created an overlay called a mixed-use overlay. To reflect that in the code, they also created an overlay there. So what's happened is that you've got older zoning districts, you've got older future land use categories, and then you've got overlays on top of them, and then you've got things that have kind of been thrown at it over time. So it became like playing four-dimensional chess to figure out what you could do with your property. One of our first goals was to get rid of these overlays, okay? We need to make the code and the instructions as simple and as clear as possible, not just for investors, not just for you as a resident, but also for your staff down at the county who sometimes feel like they can't even answer the questions that are asked of them because they have to interpret this myriad of information. So eliminate the overlays. To do that, as part of the comp plan, we've created new future land use maps that I'll talk about in a moment. And then with each CRA, there will be a rezoning of the entire CRA. If you're a resident here, you're going to get a piece of mail that's going to say that Martin County is rezoning your property. And my job and our job is to help you not panic about that, because as we walk through this effort together, I think you'll see that this is really an effort not to change at all the character of Hobe Sound, not to give anybody extra height or density or any of that, but to make your future more predictable through the rules that you have on the books. Because right now, it's hard to tell what anybody can do. As I said, you go all the way back, 2000, Hobe Sound the CRA was created. There was a whole visioning process that happened in each of the CRAs. You as a community back then said, this is what we're interested in. This is who we want to be as we continue to evolve and grow. And keep in mind, cities are never done. Cities are never complete. You don't get a CO for the city. They're always evolving, they're always changing, so it's important to stay on top of things. 10 years ago when we were working in the CRAs, nobody had ever heard of Uber, right? What does that do to your parking requirements? Does it have an impact? In some cities it does. So you need to stay on top of these things, and this is a good time to freshen up as well. As I mentioned, we created Chapter 18, the new chapter in the Comprehensive Plan of Martin County that's dedicated to the CRAs. And we created Article 12 in the Land Development Regulations that is also dedicated to the CRAs. Chapter 18 established the new land use categories that I'll talk about in a minute, and it removed the overlays, as well as a number of other things. Some relief has been provided to smaller properties in the CRAs. One of the things that we found, and we find this in cities all over the place, is that oftentimes the code requirements, like let's say for stormwater, are biased in favor of those that can afford to do underground vaulting or things of that nature, or have enough land to cut off 5 acres for a retention pond. Those typically are the bigger and bigger developers, which are the folks we hear oftentimes aren't what you want to see infilling in your communities. What we hear over and over again is we like the infill, the small, quaint stuff. We don't want to see Jensen Beach Boulevard leveled so that we can have, you know, a condo there or something like that. So one of the things we've done in the comp plan is try to balance it out. Try to give the smaller investors, so they don't have to follow some of the same rules that the big investors have to follow. Your stormwater requirements and approach for, say, the Winn-Dixie site shouldn't be the same for my 50 by 100 foot infill lot on Dixie. Chapter 18 was adopted at the second public hearing in September. That is in the books, that is law now. And it enables us to do what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. So as I mentioned, this is your future land use map, which is part of the comprehensive plan. It tells you what you can do from a 30,000 foot level. Notice you got 2 of them here because you got all these colors and then you got the mixed use overlay area. And sometimes those boundaries align and sometimes they don't. And sometimes the zoning or the land use is residential, but the mixed use says you can do mixed use with the commercial. And so it just becomes difficult to figure out what you can actually do. We've compressed it into this single map, which has 2 new categories. And this is a lot of information tonight, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible. But when you look at the CRAs, by driving through or from an aerial, you'll notice 2 things. There are the more commercial in historic areas, and then a lot of residential, like Port Salerno. Most of Port Salerno is single family. When we think of Port Salerno, at least me, you think of Manatee Pocket and the cool waterfront stuff. But the vast majority of Port Salerno to the west is single family fabric. We're not trying to change that. So we've created 2 new land use categories. One is called CRA Center, and the CRA Center follows pretty much the boundaries of what was the mixed use overlay that was established before. And the reason for that is because the mixed use overlay identified the area that you as a community said, you know what, this is really our downtown. This is where the most intense stuff goes. By intense, I don't mean 10 or 5 stories. I mean, you know, your Main Street type stuff. The vast majority of the rest of it, we have created a category called CRA Neighborhood. Okay, and the whole intent of that is to preserve and protect the neighborhoods that exist. You'll see some other colors here that weren't affected, like there is recreational or public conservation or industrial. Those aren't being impacted by what we're doing at all, so they just carried over. But this would be your new future land use map. As I said, the Article 12, which is the rezoning, and it sets up sub-districts, I'll talk about in a minute. This is part of the Land Development Regulations, Article 12. The chassis of Article 12 was adopted in September, along with the Jensen Beach Code. So we started in Jensen Beach. With Jensen Beach, we did the comp plan amendments, and I separate those because those have to go to the state for state review, and we did the rezoning for Jensen Beach. Jensen Beach is completed. Jensen Beach's new code is in effect. These are your zoning maps. These are what occur in the land development regulations. Notice you have two of them here. As I said before, because you've got the base zoning. Some of it, by the way, is zoning, correct my date, Irene, from like 1967, is that right?
Yeah.
It's not even usable. Like you have to, if you want to do something other than single family, you got to rezone your own property sometimes. So, I mean, this is just a general cleanup in addition to some of the new stuff we're talking about. But this is important because there's two maps. Again, there's that overlay thing. Am I in, am I out? Do I have to do mixed use? I don't really know. In the old comp plan, it used to say that if you had a future land use of commercial, but you were in the mixed use overlay, you could do residential if you did a mixed use project with some percentage of residential versus commercial. So if I'm on a 50 by 100 foot lot, a mixed use project is a building. So you're telling me to do residential, I've got to do a single building with multiple uses in that building, and who regulates that over time? I use our office where we live in Stewart as an example all the time. In fact, we're on Camden Street in downtown Stewart, and our office is built in like 24 or something like that. It's an old apartment building. We had a meeting the other day, and this guy comes in, he's like, I used to live in this building. He's like, I used to live in that corner. I'm like, I live there now. That's my office. But it had 8 units. Its net density was 32 units to the acre. We're not proposing that. Don't worry. But the idea is that buildings adapt over time. And you want them to adapt over time. It would be far too presumptuous for James here to tell you what your uses, or me, I'm picking on James, but what are the right uses for your building going forward in perpetuity. So we've gotten rid of that. And the new zoning is a single district for all of Hobe Sound. With that comes what we call a regulating plan. It's a lot of information, I know. The regulating plan is what goes down on a parcel by parcel basis and says you are in the core subdistrict, or you are in the corridor subdistrict, or you are in the general subdistrict. I will tell you the information that I'm presenting to you visually tonight, this is all still very much a work in progress. So I don't want you to take any of these colors, if you can even see them. I don't want you to take any of these colors to heart at the moment. We're still testing on a lot by lot basis. But this is the framework for what we're doing. And we're getting very close, I think, to resolving a lot of the issues via these documents. The regulating plan identifies your subdistricts, which tells you what density you have, what you're permitted, tells you what building types you're allowed to build. I'll go over that in a moment. Identifies locations for new streets. In some cases, the vision plans from years ago said, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we had a new street that connected here, or even a pedestrian paseo, because it's a big, big block, and to walk all the way around takes forever. Jensen Beach, the whole center part of Jensen Beach, north of Jensen Beach Boulevard in downtown, is vacant. And so what is the plan for that? So you'll see that the regulating plans, if you ever take a close look at them, have more than just what your regular zoning map would have. Your zoning map would say your R3A or your GC2 or whatever. These maps identify more. They give more information to you as a resident. We identify civic sites. You'll see as we look at closer up. You know, this building is identified as a civic site. It's important that anybody who's coming in to invest, say, or to move here, that they kind of know what's going on the ground and that that's protected. So Article 12, I won't go through all the details, but imagine there are 7 different divisions, okay, subchapters, if you will. Division 1 is what we call general. These are rules that apply to all of the CRAs, okay? They're very, well, they're general, and they apply to all the CRAs. The way the whole Article 12 is structured is that each subsequent division, Division 2, Jensen Beach, Division 3, Rio, Division 4, Palm City, thank you, and then Division 5, which is you guys here, is Hobe Sound. Keep in mind, we cannot remove all of the rules for these CRAs until we have, from the books, until we have rules to replace them, because you can't simply be ruleless. So as we adopt, hopefully, fingers crossed, as we adopt each of these CRA codes going forward, there will be a repeal and replace process. So that's why it's broken up into these chapters. So in the future, if you're looking to see, I want to invest in this property, what can I do? You would go to Article 12, you'd look, I'm in Hobe Sound, you're in Division 5, and then you can find out in the regulating plan exactly your property, and then it tells you pretty much what you can do. And what we've done is we've created what we think is an operating system that is consistent for all of the CRAs. So the instructions, the methodology, the graphics, the language is consistent through all of them. Now each one is tailored for each CRA. Because as I mentioned, Manatee Pocket is very different than Zeus Park, obviously. So those rules aren't going to absolutely apply across the board. They get tailored to the unique conditions. One of the things we did too, uses is a really, really tricky business in planning and zoning. For a number of reasons. Number one is that there's a lot of uses that have just like sediment have collected in codes. Not just Martin County, I mean anywhere. Haberdasheries. Should we allow them or should we prohibit them? Does anybody even know what it is, So one of the things that we found is that for each of the CRAs, to make them as user-friendly as possible, there's like 148 different uses that are permitted throughout the CRAs. All 6. Not all 148 are permitted in all of the CRAs. But what we did is in Division 1, that general section, we created what we call use groups. So that now, instead of having 3 pages of permitted uses in Hobe Sound, you've got 1 page. And it tells you what use groups are permitted in which of the sub-districts. Now this is where the legal department is critically important. I said this earlier and I want to say it again. This is not an effort to gift you or anybody additional height or density. Through the adjustment of lines and the aligning of boundaries, some folks may find themselves, a lot or two may find themselves, bless you, with 8 units to the acre as opposed to 5. But that's simply a process of realigning the boundaries. And that occurs literally on a lot by lot basis. The flip side of that, as I said before, this is not an effort to take away anybody's development rights. So we have that fine balance that we have to strike.
Dana, quick question. Not that I have a personal need, but one of the new uses is the marijuana dispensaries. Have those been brought into the counties?
No. So you may start to get the sense that this is kind of a big effort, especially for Martin County. Rezoning, county-initiated future land use. It's not that we're trying to avoid that topic. It's an important topic. Another important topic that's come up is what if we want to have incentive programs for targeted industries? Not that you would incent marijuana distributors.
You don't need to.
You don't need to, right. That's what I meant to say. But we don't want this effort to get bogged down on a single issue that should be given its own attention. Marijuana dispensaries is an important enough issue that it needs to be addressed, I think, on its own. What we're doing is we're setting up the infrastructure for you all to have those conversations and either add to or take away from. I don't know how this would work legally in the county if one CRA could allow marijuana dispensaries and one could not.
Yeah.
I don't know. If the county if there was a county ordinance that allowed it countywide, I don't know if you could restrict it that way. Another use that came up the other day in one of our interviews is urban farming. In Stewart we have, some of you may have seen ground floor farms, which is a really cool thing. Should you be allowed to have that in Hobe Sound? Do you want it? And if so, where should it go? So when we finish our work, like I said, the work is never done. There will always be time to add and discuss things. But marijuana is very important. Quote me on that. So it's an important discussion to have. Susan just reminded me. Yes, we're on film. Thank you. One of the things too is that we wanted to be succinct in showing, you know, what can I do? What are my setbacks? What's my density? What's my height? Wherever I am. So we've also created something called development standards that's in, you know, as part of the code. So then what you see here is this is the core district. This is the general district. Core, by the way, remember, is your downtown area. That's the one that follows the mixed use overlay. This is corridor. This is multifamily. This is mobile home, thank you. And then detached. So quickly you can see what are the building heights that are allowed, and yes ma'am.
Is any of this ever grandfathered in that it's carried over into that property? Like any impact fees or anything like that? Is the CRA ever grandfathered that property was there and that it's grandfathered within ever?
Okay, I think that was two different questions. If it's if a property is currently grandfathered in, that carries forward, absolutely. Okay, and the rules that apply to properties that are grandfathered in carry over. So say that you are grandfathered might mean, say that you are a use that's, we had a gentleman in Old Palm City, I'll use this as an example. He has an air conditioning business that's on the edge of a neighborhood, and it's been there for, I don't know, 40 years?
50 years.
It is not a permitted use today. And through this process, his business stays intact. This is not an effort to remove any of those uses. However, there are very specific rules existing today in Martin County. Like for instance, if you are what's called an existing non-conforming use, meaning that I'm not allowed, but I've been here forever, so I'm allowed to stay. If your business shuts down it's a year, right? For 1 year, you lose those rights. But those rights are transferable. It's not that if you are Dana's Yard and Soil, that I have to forever remain that. I could sell it to somebody else.
And we would be grandfathered.
And they could have a commercial.
Yes, and they could have a commercial business. A lot of what, and you have to trust us on this, I understand that. A lot of what we're doing, we're carrying forward a lot of the existing rules. We're just reorganizing them in the way that so people can actually understand what they are. Except for, as I said, in those cases where there are misalignments of boundaries, there are many cases where, and I'm not saying this is in Hobe Sound necessarily, but there are many cases where you might have a future land use that is commercial and a zoning that's residential, or vice versa. And those are in conflict with one another. So that means somebody in the county has got to make an interpretation or allow you to do something. We are trying to fix that as we go forward.
Mr. Little?
Sir.
I'd like to follow through on a comment you made about the use, the AC non-conforming use. The comment was it would cede over to the next guy that sells it, wants to do the AC business, etc. As long as the use stays the same. If the use changes, then if your AC business, for
Right.
example, today is allowed in LC, I don't think it is, but let's say LC, and LC has all these other uses.
Right.
And he sells his AC business, but now the guy wants to do use C
Right.
LC. I don't know that that's based.
Let me repeat the question.
I wanted to
Yes.
say.
The question is, if I have an air conditioning business today and it's a legal non-conformity, do I have to sell it to somebody who's going to operate an air conditioning business? Do I have to sell it to somebody who's going to operate the same named air conditioning business? Or can somebody who's just interested in running a commercial business, so long as the impacts are the same, can buy it? Is that the question? Is that fair?
Fair.
Fair. The answer is
Yes.
yes.
I mean, no, it doesn't have to stay Dave's air conditioner.
No, you can sell it to somebody who has commercial interests so long as the impacts are consistent.
If it stays plumbing, it's fine.
Yeah.
Michael's plumbing. Or Michael's.
Yeah. No, that point was brought up very specifically by the owner of this particular business. Very successful business, by the way, and it's not harming the neighborhood, but it raises the question, you know, should it be rezoned to commercial even though it's in a residential neighborhood, separated a few lots from other residential uses? So the point is, if you're grandfathered today, you're grandfathered tomorrow out of this process, and the same rules apply. This is not an effort to extinguish non-conforming uses. I see you taking notes there. Now I'm nervous. So the way that we regulate The way that we regulate like building setbacks and help to identify what heights are, where parking goes, and that sort of thing, we have an array of what we call building types. We are coding by building type. Now, in previous years, many of the CRAs did already have building types. So we think that's a good method to go forward. This is just this is just from the code. This shows the list of building types that are out there. And we're actually making up new ones as we go along. When we were in Rio, you know, you've got businesses that want to come in and do boat barns that are on the water, perfectly legitimate, but not on your main street. So how do you mitigate that? Well, we came up with a boat barn building type, which is that if you're on a certain street and you're doing a boat barn, which is like, you know, a 200-foot long piece of sheet metal, that you need to have some habitable uses on the ground floor. So you're not building walls on your main street, you know? It's not a matter of being so prohibitive, but accommodating requests in a way that doesn't take you away from your vision that you've always had. So as an example, here in the core, shopfront building, you're permitted. Mixed-use building, you're permitted. Office building, you're permitted. Apartment building, you're permitted. However, all-yard house, which is like a big single-family house, you don't want that on your main street. And so we think that these are reasonable. We're trying to be as flexible as possible. But you'll see as we go forward, each building type has a page dedicated to it, which shows you an image of how tall it is, the dimensions, what the setbacks are, where the parking goes. There's a description, because people are like, well, like an office building. You're saying that you're not prescribing by use, but it's an office building. Well, when somebody builds an office building, they're designing it in a certain way. We're not saying that it always has to remain office, but there are certain things about an office building that are different than an apartment building. You don't have multiple kitchens. You don't have bathrooms as frequently. You probably have a central core and stair. You know, it has its own implications. But to be clear, we regulate use, as I said, by the sub-district. So if you build an office building, the reverse of actually our office. If you build an apartment building, it can become an office later. Or if you build an office building, if it makes sense and the floor plates work and all of that, it could become residence later, or a mixed-use building. The idea is you get the right building in the right place so that we don't have to keep knocking stuff down and replacing things, and that we can adaptively reuse buildings over time. As all great places do, by the way. If there wasn't adaptive reuse, sorry, I keep interrupting myself, you wouldn't have historic districts necessarily. You wouldn't have, you know, main streets like Jensen. We also talk about building frontage types. These are more architectural standards so that you don't end up with arcades that are only 18 inches deep. You know, an arcade to function actually has to be wide enough that two people can walk side by side. Things like that. You know, having front porches on houses that are only 2 feet deep, you know, so it looks like a veneer on the front of your house. All you can do is store bicycles on it. You know, you can't actually use it. So we've got some architectural standards that go along with this as well. And then we are working with the MPO and with the engineering department that in the case that you would build a new street in the future, or if you wanted to improve, say, US 1 or something like that, there are some illustrative street sections or street standards that are there just as reference. Already, in fact, one of them is being implemented in Rio on Church Street. Oh, excuse me, Jensen. So I'm wrapping this up, I promise, but I just wanted to give you a taste of some of the specific issues that we're trying to address as we go forward. So this is your core of Hobe Sound, okay? We're right here. Yeah, we're right here. No, sorry, we're right there. Actually, I missed this turn because I didn't think the street went through. And then I got tangled up in an accident down here. And I was on the phone and the police officer stopped me and I thought I was going to get arrested. All of this on the way here this thing. So when I mentioned before the mixed-use overlay area, this red represents the mixed-use overlay area as it exists today, as established back in 2002, 2003. Now, I don't know about you, but there's an obvious omission, I think, in the mixed-use area. Maybe it was by design, I don't know. But one of our recommendations, I can tell you right now, this is an absolute recommendation, is that the Winn-Dixie site be included in your core area. That's the single largest redevelopment site that you have, potential redevelopment site that you have in your town. And you certainly don't want to leave that up to chance. You want to have regulations in place that give you some predictability about what that's going to be. You don't want that to become the next Walmart necessarily, or something else. I don't know what it could be. Yes, ma'am.
For those of us sitting in the back who can't see that, could you delineate out the street area of the mixed use?
Okay, I'm sorry. This is Bridge Road.
Okay.
This is Dixie. This is the southern edge of Zeus Park. Saturn, thank you. This is Olympus. Here's the park. We're right here. What's missing is the Winn-Dixie Shopping Center. So what we're proposing is that you add the Winn-Dixie Shopping Center into your core regulations because it's too big of an opportunity to lose going forward. Here's an example. Yes, sir.
Why didn't it cross US 1?
Why doesn't this cross US 1?
Correct.
I don't know.
It seems like we have another commercial core that's developing on the west side of US 1 there.
You do. You have the public shopping center. It's of a different nature, though, I think, than Bridge Road to the east.
It's still Bridge Road.
It is still Bridge Road.
Right hand, left hand?
Yeah, no, but
We don't know what we're doing.
no, there are, forgive me. Let me back up. Maybe I misunderstood your question. The CRA extends beyond Federal Highway. It includes Banner Lake, etc. So the rules that we're rewriting do go west of Federal.
But the core.
The core specifically.
The core crosses Bridge Road. No. It crosses US 1.
Not currently.
That's the problem.
Okay. I think that's debatable, but I'm glad you brought it up.
Debate belongs on the hook. Right now we're talking about it's a problem. Because
Debate belongs on the, oh, sorry.
Debate.
Got it. I've never heard that. Sorry.
Okay, because if you look at the dollar amount of retail activity, the dollar amount of retail activity that occurs on the west side of US 1 is greater than that occurs on the east side of US 1. So if you use a simple delineation of economic activity, the core is on both sides.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. And maybe I should help a little bit by defining when we're talking about the core as was established early on in the vision plan of Hobe Sound, like the other CRAs, that's really meant to be your focal destination for pedestrian activity, for bicyclists, shops, cafes, mixed use. I don't argue with you at all about the economic power on the west side, not at all. I don't live here, but you can kind of visibly see it from the street. And that's doing fine in its current format, I think. But what we're trying to do in the core, at least, is promote the smaller, more infill, walkable type of stuff. The downtown character. That's all that's meant to mean. It's not meant to take anything away from that. It's just to reflect that there are different development patterns and they have different physical conditions, different experiences, that's all.
Different money behind them.
I don't know about that, but you would know.
Publix.
Okay. Well, yeah, Publix, of course. Yes, sir.
Isn't part of the reason why Publix and that whole shopping center is not in the CRA is because of the PUD?
Well, the Publix is...
Well, it's just part of that PUD that's on that corner. The bank is not, but the out parcels that come up to Bridge Road, as well as...
Oh, you're talking about the you're talking about Winn-Dixie?
No, the public shopping center on the west side of US 1.
Okay, yes.
That bump out there.
Right.
PUD is not part of the CRA because regulating, if I understand right, regulating PUDs is more difficult than...
Well, and it's already fully baked. We're not going to affect that through this effort. So, just quickly, a couple other slides, and then I'll wrap up. This is one of the examples that I was talking about before. This is the same area. This is Petway near where the Habitat for Humanity properties are. This is Petway here. It has a future land use of medium density, medium residential density, which allows up to 8 units per acre. However, when you look at the context of what's out there today, it's primarily single family. So I'm just telling you, I don't have a resolution for this tonight, but one of the things that we struggle with is, should we apply zoning that allows less density to be more consistent with the character, right, of the single family. I would agree with that. However, we also have to protect investors, somebody who owns a house or maybe he owns a vacant lot that bought it because of the 8 units per acre, so we have to balance that. And that's part of the machinations that we're going through with the legal department and growth management. Another example, though, this one's slightly different, where again, you have the same medium density of up to 8 units per acre. A lot of people are surprised that, gosh, I'm allowed 8 units per acre, it's single family. But that's been on the books for a while. However, in this area near Wyndham and Southeast Pine Circle, there's a lot of duplexes that are in place. And those can actually yield up to 8 units per acre when you do some of the math, depending upon the lot sizes, etc. So we're trying to, mitigate these sometimes conflicting, you mentioned value before, sir, some of the valuations of things, because people will often, especially folks from out of town, they'll buy a piece of property based upon what they think they can do on it, the density or the height, etc. Height is a funny thing I'm sorry?
But they don't vote.
Well, yeah, that's possibly true.
Remember that. They don't vote.
Which is why we're here with you this evening. So height is a funny thing in Hobe Sound. These are the current allowable heights in your core area. So west of Federal, you're allowed 2 stories and up to 30 feet. Along Federal here, you're allowed up to 40 feet and 2 stories. Here, along Bridge, you're allowed 2 stories up to 35 feet, except for the north side of Bridge where the Winn-Dixie is, you're allowed 3 stories up to 35 feet. So, yes, ma'am.
A lot of us showed up here because of that 8 units per whatever per acre. And we're not clear whether or not, and I don't know if you know, if the property that's Sunshine State Cremations or whatever in Hobe Sound, is that already at that density, or is it?
Okay, so we are working just within the CRA boundaries.
That's all we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, that's all we're...
But you don't know.
No, I don't know. I'm sorry. That property is outside of the CRA. The CRA has really no authority over that property at all. And I'm not trying to kick it down the road, but that's an issue for the local planning agency and the Board of County Commissioners. It's outside of the CRA.
So if we call the local planning agency, that's what we're hearing?
No, we can help her.
If you have questions about Sunshine Carnations, you can call the Growth Management Department and get your questions answered. It's not a topic for tonight's meeting.
Right. I just was wondering.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Irene. So anyway, what's that? So as we go through this process, should we sort of normalize the height conditions along along Bridge Road? Like for instance, if it's okay to have 3 stories and 35 feet on the north side of the road, should it be okay to have 3 stories and 35 feet on the south side of the road? The building heights are relatively the same, and over here on Dixie, it's 35 feet, but it's only 2 stories. So should you be allowed to have 3 stories and 35 feet? I'll tell you, just as an example, when we were working in Old Palm City's gone through its first round of approvals with the Board of County Commissioners. All of Old Palm City in the CRA is allowed to be, 3 stories and up to 35 feet, except for Map Road. For some reason, Map Road, their main street, which is getting millions of dollars of improvement right now, and has a right-of-way that's 100 feet, by the way, is limited to 2 stories. So we said, look, we're just planners, but this seems a little inverted. It seems like you would want to have your main street have 3 stories. So we did a series of before and after models just to show that 3 stories isn't going to block out the light and all of that stuff. And the community agreed that they don't mind seeing 3 stories. What does 3 stories mean? It means that you might get townhouses, 3-story townhouses, which are, a beautiful type of project if done well. It might mean you won't get any 3-story buildings. There may not be a market for 3-story buildings, but at least to have some consistency in the rules, And maybe we could, after I wrap up here in a minute, we could, if anybody wants to chime in about that, I mean, especially in your core area, particularly along Bridge and along Dixie, to normalize those building heights.
Let me ask
Yes,
you
sir.
something. In the original CRA, you had thematic architecture that kind of defined the roof pitches, and yeah, height was one of the variables, but the theme is not being considered anymore.
That's a very good question. The question was, in the current CRA documents and regulations, there's a lot of architectural theming, a lot of architectural style and design considerations. The question is, are we not considering that as we go through this? Yes and no. I say that because, as I mentioned earlier, in some of the frontage standards and things like that, we're dealing with some of the core elements of architecture, so that you have appropriate porch depths and appropriate arcade depths. I think that there's been some confusion, as I've heard over time, as to whether some of those architectural design guidelines, were they regulatory, were they suggestions? And I think that we still need to do some work on that, but this is not meant to be require architectural styles. That's not what this effort is about.
But you could certainly incentivize.
You could
So we have a neighborhood that has some contextual continuity.
Okay. Well, let's hear some more about that tonight then, because I think that that's something that we could try to address. What's challenging for us as the Regional Planning Council with staff is that each CRA has some or more than others, and so there hasn't been a consistent application. Like Rio has a whole code that was never even adopted. You know, Jensen Beach has these incredible street standards that kind of just were set aside. So we could address architecture and maybe even just lift what you already have and clarify that it is not a regulatory document, but it's very, very useful as a desk guide for staff and for anybody that comes in for projects. I mean, we work in architectural standards a lot. It's just very hard to regulate them sometimes, especially if it's outside of like a historic district where you're protecting bona fide styles, do you know? But I hear what you're saying, and we'll put effort into that.
Is there any consideration to changing the height based on the setback from the street?
No, not at this point in time. I mean, I know that some cities do that, but typically that's for buildings that are at least 5 stories, you know, where you start to have a separation. I worked in Delray Beach for a long time. Actually, I think it's at the 3rd level it steps back. You have a maximum of 3 stories, period. So I think that becomes, you know, and maybe you'll think this is a good thing, but that becomes a costly disincentive for somebody to invest in a 3-story building if they have to step back. Structurally, it's challenging. You're losing some of the leasable floor plate or usable floor plate, and these are very small lots. What we have done, as I said before, to try to balance the scales for smaller investors or smaller property owners, as I mentioned, is that there are some reliefs that have been put in place. One thing we've heard about a lot over time: density transition. I don't know if you've ever heard of density transition. We've basically removed density transition as it currently exists from the CRAs and replaced it with very physical step-back requirements, actually, to your point. Not related so much to the setback, but what we've put in the code is that if there's an existing single-family house and you're coming in with a new structure and you're exceeding 2 stories, you have to step that 3rd level back at least, I think it's 25 or 30 feet from the property line, so that there is a physical massing transition for existing single-family houses.
Just a quick reminder for anyone with a question or a comment, please state your name for the record. Jen is here furiously scribbling down notes for the meeting, and she does need your name for the minutes going forward. Thank you.
So finally, one of the things that we wanted to bring up tonight, and this is just for discussion, we don't really have a strong opinion about this one way or another, but in Jensen Beach, for example, Jensen Beach, more so than any of the other CRAs that we've worked in to date, except for Hobe Sound, has a very clear and well-defined main street, Jensen Beach Boulevard. When you come in from the roundabout, That's Main Street, it's clear, there's no debating that. Sometimes there's concerns that those could be redeveloped or changed over time and maybe replaced with residential uses, and then that continuity of like the Main Street tends to be diluted. So in Jensen Beach, we created what's called a required commercial frontage for that stretch of Jensen Beach Boulevard, which is Main Street. And basically what that means is that commercial uses are required on the ground floor. I mean, it's not meant to be punitive, but you can't put residential on the ground floor for those 2 blocks so that you keep Main Street intact. I have a love-hate relationship with this type of approach because sometimes planners use it, I think, too aggressively. So I think you need to use it very carefully. But we wanted to bring it up tonight because Hobe Sound, like Jensen Beach, has, you know, an intact, especially from here, from Lars over, and then south on Dixie, you have a pretty strong, you know, Main Street fabric. So we throw that out there for discussion. If anybody thinks that it's important to maintain for a block or 2 those commercial uses going forward and limit residential. I wouldn't do it any further west than Lars personally and professionally, because I think that Winn-Dixie, when it ultimately redevelops at some point, hopefully in our lifetimes, that there's an opportunity there to do residential. I mean, it could be a beautiful townhouse community or something like that. Not a gated community by any means, but could have public open space, a civic plaza, things like that, that really mark the entry into Bridge Road and historic Hobe Sound. And so for consideration, I just put these lines up there for discussion later. So thank you for your patience. I know this is a lot of information. As I said, tonight is meant entirely for information. We're not presenting any strong recommendations to you this evening, except for the one I made earlier, which I forget what it is now. And we're here for any questions, so thank you very much.